Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're doing something slightly different and I'm going to show you how you can use one simple bread dough recipe to make 3 different flavored loaves of bread. The dough is just made with yeast, so there's no need for a sourdough starter or anything like that. The base recipe is actually a very popular recipe on our blog, which you can find linked here. It's called laine or country bread, a country style loaf. People love how simple it is, how soft the bread is with a nice crust, and how delicious the flavor is. Today we're using this base recipe to make a jalapeno and cheese loaf, a raisin and walnut loaf, and a chocolate chip loaf. So this will satisfy all of your savory and sweet needs, and hopefully this video will give you the confidence to try out any loaves with any flavor combinations you can think of. In this video, I'll also show you different methods of scoring the dough and also different methods of baking the loaves if you don't have a Dutch oven, for example. Let's get baking. To start, I'm just adding 2 teaspoons of instant yeast to each bowl. Obviously, here I'm making all 3 loaves at the same time, but if you just want to make one, then the ingredients listed in this video are per loaf. Each loaf then needs about 300 milliliters of warm water and 3/4 of a tablespoon of sugar to help the yeast bloom. I whisk this to help the yeast dissolve and then add your dry ingredients. 100 grams of whole wheat flour per loaf. You could also use rye flour here if you like. Then you need 300 grams of white flour, all-purpose or plain or bread flour works, and 1.5 teaspoons of salt per loaf. Mix this together until you have a shaggy dough. I then added the raisins and walnuts to one of the doughs and kneaded it until it was evenly distributed, but I decided to leave the other doughs to rise and add the other inclusions when I was shaping them. So leave these for about 30 minutes, make sure to cover them and put them in a warm place, and then it's time to complete the first set of stretch and folds. So stretch and fold is a technique. You give the dough some structure because you didn't knead it, so you just pull the sides of the dough up and into the middle and rotate the bowl as you go. It's very quick. Obviously, I did it with 3 loaves, but if you're just doing it with one, it takes about a minute, 2 minutes. This first batch of dough was a bit drier than the second, as you can see, which means I probably wasn't being very precise earlier when I was measuring the water. It happens, and honestly, it won't make much of a difference in the end, as you'll see. So I then completed the stretch and folds of the 3rd loaf and let this rise for another 30 minutes, and then it's time to do the same stretch and fold technique one more time. You can see that they're getting really nice and big and jiggly, so there's plenty of air in there, and that's what you want to see. Cover and give them another 15 minutes to rise and prepare the inclusions, so chop the chocolate and chop the cheese and the jalapeños, and now we're moving on to the pre-shaping stage. This is where we're adding our inclusions. So I'm starting with the chocolate loaf and pulling it out into a rectangle, then adding the chocolate and folding it carefully and pinching the dough together to try to keep the chocolate inside the loaf. That is the key. You don't have to be super delicate with the dough, but just be careful. Things like shaping dough take a lot of practice, and even with practice, it's a very challenging thing to do well. You want to flip the loaf so it's seam side down and do a couple of push and pulls just to create some tension on the surface of the dough, but really be careful doing this with an inclusion loaf because you don't want the chocolate to tear the dough. Moving on to the raisin and walnut loaf. This one is easy because we already added the inclusions, so we just have to pre-shape it into a loaf. So pinch it together into a seam, flip it so it's seam side down, and do some push and pulls. It's almost like shaping a roll, but just a giant version of it. Now onto the last pre-shape. If you're not sure if your dough has risen enough, you could always use the poke test. So if you poke it and it leaves an indentation but slowly springs back, it's ready to use. Here I just followed the same process as I did with the chocolate, just with cheese and jalapeños and some sun-dried tomatoes instead. Remember, be gentle, but you can be firm with your dough and just press it together into the shape it needs to be. Just make sure those inclusions aren't tearing the dough too much or might end up with a bit of a mess in the oven. Now let's move on to the final shaping stage. Here we pretty much do the same thing we did in the pre-shaping stage, but we're just trying to really give it the final shape it's gonna need to rise properly in the oven. As you can see, this is challenging with inclusions. The chocolate was really trying to tear out of the loaf here, but I just quickly shaped it and left it alone so I didn't make the problem any worse. These are going to rise again for about 20 minutes before baking, so once I had shaped my 3rd and final loaf, the first one was pretty much ready to bake, which was very convenient. Obviously, if you're just baking one loaf, you're going to need to let this rise again for 20 minutes. We sometimes like to let it have that rise in the fridge just so it's easier to score. Obviously, with 3 loaves, I didn't have room to do that. Here I used the poke test again to check that my chocolate loaf was ready to bake. Again, it left an indentation but sprung back, so I knew it was ready. I went for a scoring method that's just a cross on the top. I like this one with inclusion loaves because it just gives you a really nice view of what's in the loaf. And once you score it, it's ready to go in a preheated Dutch oven. The oven should be set to 230 degrees Celsius or 445 degrees Fahrenheit. The loaf goes in with the lid on for 20 minutes, then you take it off and see how it's risen beautifully, and leave it for 5 to 10 minutes with the lid off until it's nice and golden brown. Inevitably, with some of the chocolate being on the outside of the loaf, it'll burn, but just eat those crunchy bits of caramelized chocolate before you share it with anyone else. That's my advice. Now to bake the raisin and walnut loaf, we're going to use a different method in case you don't have a Dutch oven, and I'm also using a different scoring method. This time I'm doing one big slice down the right hand side and then a nice leaf pattern. In the preheated oven, place the baking sheet and then pour some boiling water into a tray at the bottom of the oven. This will create the steam that you want without a Dutch oven. And if there are any raisins on the outside, beware that they get absolutely cremated, so just pick them off if they're burnt on the outside. For the third and final loaf, I just did 3 slashes across it, one of the more boring scoring methods, but it works just as well as the others, and I used the Dutch oven for this. I just think it's better for inclusion loaves with things like cheese that might get a bit messy. So now that all the loaves are out of the oven, you just have to wait for them to cool, and then you can slice them and see how they look on the inside. The chocolate loaf looks very good texture-wise. Obviously, the chocolate has all sort of gone to one section of the loaf, but that's okay. And the raisin and walnut loaf looks a lot better. So perhaps adding the chocolate earlier on in the mixing process would have been better, but you also run the risk of it melting in the warm dough. And this loaf was so delicious. I really like the sun-dried tomatoes in there, which wasn't in the plan, but it was a great addition nonetheless. We hope you try out one of these recipes. All the information can be found in the description below the video, but feel free to mix up the flavors and use whatever you have in your kitchen. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next video. Bye!